Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and I've been in talks with a couple of people from time to time talking a bit about Subtlety Rogues. If you guys play Subtlety or play Rogues in general, most of you guys know for PvP, Subtlety is just not the best spec. It's still great, it's still awesome. Rogues have honestly nothing to complain about as of Battle for Azeroth, in my opinion, when it comes to being able to be viable and pushing out damage, PvP or PvE. That being said, Subtlety in PvP right now feels a lot more underwhelming than it has been, I feel like, in a while. Recent nerfs have happened to Subtlety that decrease their damage by, what, 10% Shadow Strike, 15% Eviscerate, and reduction to the crit chance from your Phantom Assassin on a talent. And that's just me going perfectly off memory. Actually, rogues have gotten nerfs every single week so far. We thought we dodged it this week, but the bully came back to bite us with Assassination Rogues getting nerfed with Flying Daggers, which actually reads, Phantom Knife's radius increased by Flying Daggers PvP talent, and Fan of Blades Azerite trait no longer stack, and Fan of Blades effectiveness reduced by 75 when engaged in combat against enemy players in PvP. Very weird changes, but rogues have gotten nerfed every single week, and we're still one of the better classes in BFA. You can't deny that. Assassination isn't in a great spot, and it is a spec for a lot of you guys to try out if you're considering PvP. That being said, as an Outlaw main, I can guarantee you guys Outlaw is in such a good spot as long as you don't find the RNG buff mechanic of Roll the Bones too intimidating. Both of those two specs are an amazing spot for PvP and PvE. Subtlety is really great in PvE, but it is very much lacking in PvP. Long story short, Subtlety doesn't deal nearly as much damage as Assassination and Outlaw, and some of you guys might say, yeah, that's normal. Subtlety is supposed to be a spec all about crowd control, being able to sap anybody whenever you want, a cheap shot on demand. Oh, it sounds super exciting, but I do understand not every person playing Rogue likes to play a CC bot, and that's where a little bit of the dissatisfaction comes with parts of the community. In this video, I kind of just want to discuss Subtlety and what can be done in order to make the spec feel better. Also point out to the parts that I think that are kind of the unsatisfying parts of the spec, primarily again in PvP, because in PvE, in raids and dungeons, Subtlety is a shining example of where it should be at. Big burst playstyle for a big burst AoE, or sustained single target playstyle where you're not worrying about burst but rather to be able to hammer damage into an enemy consistently. In PvP, however, that's not really the case. Right now what Subtlety is ahead in for PvP is crowd control. If you watch people play at higher rated ladders for Subtlety, you have a lot of CC. But when it comes to damage, besides whatever burst you can muster with your Shadow Dances and Symbols of Death and Shadow Blades, you don't really have a lot to follow afterwards. You don't have any sustain either. All the tools that you had for burst or sustain have been nerfed. 10% nerf to Shadow Strike, 15% to Eviscerate, and even the critical strike nerf. What I felt was great about Subtlety, at least at the beginning of BFA, before we realized just how overpowered it was, before we realized there were certain Azerite traits that made it completely busted, broken, absolutely ridiculous. It felt great to be able to pop Shadow Dance and just do some damage. And right now, rogues are at a point where, as Subtlety, when you pop in Shadow Dance, you don't really deal damage. You can lock someone down for a very long while, between cheap shots, saps, kidneys, blinds. There's a lot of crowd control at your disposal. To be able to have access to cheap shot whenever you want to, as long as you have a charge of Shadow Dance, is insanely strong. But not being able to back up damage by yourself doesn't feel quite as great. When you play in arenas or battlegrounds and you are the CC bot, you basically rely on someone else to do damage. And while CC in the world is great, especially good in arenas in a specific comp, there are a lot of rogues that want to be able to have crowd control, but also don't want to have to miss the damage, which is why a lot of people are switching themselves over to Assassination, because the spec has a fair amount of control that rogues do, but also doesn't sacrifice on damage. So we know that Subtlety rogues are going to get better as the time goes on, because we tend to scale with damage. So in patch 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, however many patches we have, we're simply just going to naturally scale. But what can we do about the spec right now to make us feel all that great? Well, let's take a look at what was great about the spec, what felt good, what are the parts that made it feel great during Shadow Dance windows. During Shadow Dance, we had Phantom Assassin providing us about 30 to 35% extra crit, so we were basically bursting with 50% crit on an enemy. You know, if half of our abilities crit, we were doing good damage. Eviscerate wasn't doing 15% less damage, and Shadow Strikes weren't doing 10% less damage. So you'll either have to go and buff other abilities or just do some kind of an overlay buff to Subtlety. Because we don't really have Subtlety scaling issues at a later time, like the further the expansion goes on, the longer the expansion is up, the better Subtlety tends to get, as we've seen in previous expansions. What if we just do a Bandaid buff? Just what a lot of other classes have gotten recently is like a slap of 4% buff to damage. Just something like that. Something where they can just slap a Bandaid buff to the spec so it starts to feel a little bit better, and they can remove it at a later time, so as we scale down the expansion, we can still have that natural progression of scaling. Because right now we can't get really that much better gear. If you got the top end gear and you're still not really pushing that much damage as Subtlety, doesn't feel that great. And to know that, hey, just wait till next patch, or the patch after that, or the patch after that, just doesn't feel quite as satisfying. If you wanted to really change Subtlety, you would want to buff its sustain damage, but also amp the burst by a little bit. Maybe like a 5% buff to backstab only, 5% buff to shadow strike as well, and maybe a 5% buff to eviscerate. This way you could have backstab damage for the sustain, shadow strike for the sustain and burst, and eviscerate for a little bit extra touch for the burst. And that's only if you want to go into detail, but I feel like a Bandaid buff for like a 4% or something, or even a 3% would be just fine. Because essentially you're buffing all your damage of your eviscerate, your shadow strike, whatever, but also your auto attack damage, also your Nightblade damage, and also your Shuriken Storm damage. And again, I feel like it would be maybe even easier for Blizzard to just add a flat 5% buff, and then when patch 8.1 rolls around, take it away, let rogues gear themselves out, and then we'll have the natural scaling. It's just something that you can kind of add in the game, but then also you can remove anytime you want to. On a side note, I will say this, it doesn't feel that great as a Subtlety Rogue to see nerfs happen to your spec, and this is something that Blizzard has done, which I did not like, and I do want to mention it. When they nerfed Subtlety, Shadow Strike nerfed, Phantom Assassin nerfed, Eviscerate nerfed, they were like, okay, let's take the Azerite gear and find a way to use the Azerite gear to get past all these nerfs. Let's take an Azerite trait for Shadow Strike, and the trait basically goes as such. Every single Shadow Strike increases the damage of your other Shadow Strikes, and it stacks up to 10. So Shadow Strikes will build a stack and buff for the rest of your Shadow Strikes with a minute duration. What if you just take 3 of those and triple stack that trait for PvP? Then we can completely nullify the nerf to Subtlety Shadow Strike damage. And then they go and nerf the trait. And it's like, okay, well, maybe we can bring back the crit guarantee. Let's take the first dance. While it was an awkward trait, it gave us a pretty high chance to guarantee crit with our eviscerate. So when we're going for big eviscerate damage and burst, at least we will know it has 100% crit. No damage increase, just 100% crit. And Blizzard inadvertently ended up making that one also kind of worse. They made it better so it's not as awkward to play, where it allows 2 abilities to have a high chance to crit, but then they reduced the crit chance by 25%. Yikes. Look, it doesn't feel that great when you're trying to find a way to get over the buffs, right? Okay, something got nerfed, this got nerfed, let me use the gear to fix it, and then the developers are like, nope, not allowed to. I don't think it's a great way of going about it. I do think the spec does need a little bit extra love from Blizzard. It is a great spec, but I feel not everybody's super excited to be a CC bot. People want to be able to see a little bit extra damage, and unless they're going to be nerfing how much CC Subtlety has, or at this point mobility, you're not really going to be bringing back any kind of damage to the spec. That's why I feel maybe like a 4% or even 3% base buff to the spec, from your auto attacks to backstabs to shadow strikes to eviscerates to the Nightblade to the Shuriken Storm. All those abilities will eventually feel a little stacked up, and it will be a minor adjustment that can go a long way. As we saw with a couple other classes getting just a 4%, 5% buff, it made them go, in PvP at least, from, I don't really know if it's that great, to, wow, we are actually doing a bit of damage. A 5% overall to all of your abilities and everything you do can go a long way. So I feel like that's maybe the best way of going about it when it comes to buffing Subtlety, if they were gonna buff it. But no guarantee if they will or won't. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed the discussion. Let me know in the comments what are your thoughts on Subtlety, and if you were to buff them, what exactly would you guys do to buff Subtlety? What are your thoughts on Subtlety? Should it get buffed? Should it get nerfed? Let me know your stuff in the comments below. But anyway guys, this is my argument to if Subtlety should get buffed, and if you were to go about it, how they would do it up until patch 8.1. I am excited to see if there's going to be any rogue changes for 8.1, particularly with Subtlety in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see all of you in the next one.